Let's bring you this discussion now. The UCT Research Unit on the Economics of Excisable Products has revealed that South Africa has lost about 119 billion rand between 2002 and 2022 solely due to the illicit trade in cigarettes. Professor Corne van Walbeek is the director of the unit, and he joins us now live for this discussion. Prof, it's great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. Is it fair to say that this loss started or sort of was exacerbated during COVID-19 times when we had the ban of cigarettes at the start of the pandemic, and that has just climbed since then?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on your show. And yes, it's true that the sales ban of 2020 certainly contributed to that. According to our research, before 2020, the illicit market was probably between 35 and 40% of the total market. So already then the market was very, very high. And to a large extent, that can be attributed to the problems that were experienced at the South African Revenue Services, especially under the leadership of Mr. Tomoyane. Many of the units that were specifically focusing on illicit trade and specifically on illicit trade in tobacco products had been abolished. And as a result, what we find is that many of the tobacco companies were basically doing as they pleased because there was nobody to really monitor them. However, what we do find is that in 2020, the illicit market increased from between 35 and 40% to close to 60%. So about 20% of the total market in cigarettes became illegal during that time period. Unfortunately, after 2020, we didn't go back to a somewhat more normal percentage of illicit trade. Those numbers stayed around 60% during that time period. The loss of revenue just since 2020 and up to 2022 probably is in the order of about 30 billion rand just due to the increase in illicit trade that happened during the 2020 sales ban period. Wow,
that's incredible. And it's incredible to have seen the climb, right? Since 2009, the illicit cigarette market made up 5%. I mean, how is it that in 15 years it's now sitting at 60%?
Yeah, I think the illicit market has had a pretty long run on. Between 1994 and 2009, the government increased the excise taxes quite dramatically. And what was basically happening is that British American Tobacco, which was at that point in time by far the dominant party in this environment, we find that they were then increasing the net of tax price significantly as a result of an increase in the excise tax. So in other words, the excise tax would increase by 1 rand, but British American Tobacco would increase the retail price by 2 or 3 rand during that period. As a result of that, cigarettes, even though sales were dropping, became incredibly profitable, and that attracted a lot of companies into the market. For a while, these companies were held under control by the South African Revenue Services. For instance, in 2005 and 2006, Mastermind, which was operating in pretty much the illegal market, they were closed down. But since 2009, 2010 onwards, we see that there's been a very significant increase in other companies coming into the market, basically trying to make as much money as possible, which was driven to a large extent by the very large profits that were being made by British American Tobacco before 2010. At this moment in time, I would guess that British American Tobacco greatly rused that pricing strategy that they had at that point in time, because basically what it did was it developed a monster that it never anticipated becoming as big as what it became.
Incredible. Now, Edward Kiswetter, the Commissioner of SARS, has said that whereas South Africa, the country, is battling the scourge of illicit cigarettes smuggled from a neighboring country. What is that neighboring country?
I suspect that he's referring to Zimbabwe, but our research, unless this has been changing dramatically over the last year or so, our research suggests that most of the illicit cigarettes are actually produced within South Africa. It's not a case that we are suddenly importing all these smuggled cigarettes from a neighboring country, probably Zimbabwe. It could potentially also be Botswana, but most probably Zimbabwe. But the big problem in South Africa is underreporting of production. So in other words, a company would produce 10 billion, or rather 10 million cigarettes, and they would only be reporting 2 or 3 million of those cigarettes, the rest coming into the market without having the tax paid and thus being illicit.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously there's the massive loss to the fiscus here in South Africa, but jobs are also on the line, right?
That is true, and that's something that, of course, a company like British American Tobacco would make a big issue of. And I'm aware that they have announced that they are retrenching something like 20 people from their own offices, and they claim that something like 500 people in downstream industries are going to be affected by this as well. To some extent, I have sympathy for that. On the other hand, one probably suspects that there are going to be more jobs created in other industries, possibly illicit companies, unfortunately, where the illicit companies are taking on more people to do the manufacturing and do the distribution of those cigarettes.
What are you saying? That there's a positive spin to that?
There's no positive spin to that, sadly not.
Yeah. So the World Health Organization, it has a protocol to eliminate illicit trade in tobacco products, right? It provides guidelines for reducing illicit trade. Are we implementing those guidelines as yet?
So the protocol came into effect probably about 8 years ago. And unfortunately, South Africa, even though we have one of the biggest problems of illicit trade in the world, we have not ratified that treaty. If we were to ratify that treaty, we would oblige ourselves to implement strategies and plans that will significantly reduce illicit trade. So the big important thing of reducing illicit trade is that you want to secure the supply chain. So by securing the supply chain, what you would then do is to make sure that tobacco companies, either through tax stamps, through processes like track and trace systems, through processes like knowing your customer and so on, you keep them accountable for the cigarettes that they sell further down. Yeah. At this point in time, the tobacco industry basically says, we're producing the stuff, we're sending it to wherever it goes, we don't take any responsibility past that point.
Yeah. SARS was granted quite a good win in the High Court. It's now able to place CCTV surveillance systems. But the problem is it's within licensed customs and excise warehouses managed by tobacco companies. Is it as much of a win when these are the licensed companies? And by all accounts from what you're saying, they're not really the problem.
No, I'm not saying that. So we know what the companies are. So if one were to go onto the street and look at different brands and pick up different empty packages, those brands are for all to see. And we know where those brands come from. And if one were to do some investigation on how much did those packets cost, basically what you would find is that many of them are being sold at prices where it's impossible for the excise tax to have been paid. So even though those companies might have been licensed and are licensed and legally licensed in that sense, we are finding that they are probably under-declaring, and this attempt by the South African Revenue Services hopefully will go some way to try and address the situation. The issue at this point in time is so catastrophic and so really a problem that pretty much any intervention will have some effect. I think that there are better interventions and there are less good interventions, but interventions are required, and I think it's good that the South African Revenue Services is putting as much priority on this as what they are at the moment.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying what I think is quite an important point. But Professor van Walbeek, do you feel that even these interventions are small steps forward in what is really a massive issue in the country?
So I'm an academic and I'm not involved in the sort of the daily operation of these types of things. But what I do find is that it sounds really nearly unbelievable that an institution that has been so good at implementing, for instance, the e-filing system and so on, and has really done really well in that sense, is unable to curb illicit trade in a product that is very visible, where there are not particularly many companies that are producing these products, and where we know where those companies have got their factories. So to my mind, it sounds like a really weird situation that we are unable to, up to this point in time, to be able to address that situation. So now I really hope that South African Revenue Services will make this a priority in months and years going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Professor Corne van Walbeek, let me thank you for your time this afternoon. He's the director of the research unit at UCT, the Economics of Excisable Products study. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.